So, when did your fascination with the Great Pyramids really begin?
My fascination with the Great Pyramid in ancient Egypt began, I guess, in my teens. Um, my parents joined an organization that was founded on the work of the American psychic and clairvoyant Edgar Cayce. And Edgar Cayce has a whole story to tell about ancient Egypt. He would give readings, as they are called, for people uh, to diagnose their health problems and prescribe remedies. And at some point in his career, he started giving readings about what life means, what it's all about. And I guess his adherents, Casey died in 1945, so this is some time ago. His adherents, I think they were all, good Christians. Casey himself was a very, I think, devout, conservative Christian, but they were all surprised when he started speaking about reincarnation. And out of the Edgar Cayce readings of this different sort, what life is all about, it's when he started giving readings for people. He would be in a self-induced hypnotic state. All of this, I will stop doing air quotes because all of this, my parents and I were following and believing, but, I don't believe anymore and have not for many, many years. But he started giving readings about who people were in their past lives. And out of these readings came this whole story that's very popular among alternative theorists to this day about Atlantis and the destruction of the civilization of Atlantis about 10,500 BC and how they came to Egypt and helped the Egyptians build the Great Pyramid and Sphinx and buried something called the Hall of Records under the Sphinx, which would contain the records of this civilization. So I I grew up, I was born and raised in North Dakota. I spent time in California, in Connecticut, on the East Coast, on the West Coast. Um, but, there were not a lot of good Egyptology libraries in my immediate surroundings. And the literature on Edgar Cayce was coming into the house. And so my interest in Egypt started through, through the Edgar Cayce material.
Fascinating, fascinating. And it hasn't let up ever since. It's been a constant growing.
Well, my interest hasn't let up, but my worldview, my perspective changed a lot because I first went over to Egypt in 1972 on an Edgar Cayce youth tour. So a bunch of people, mostly young people, which I was at that time, all like-minded. And we went to Egypt and other countries, and I vowed to go back um, by any means that I could. I don't know, something about ancient Egypt really turned me on. And so within a year, I was back as a year abroad student at the American University in Cairo, an English language liberal arts college university in downtown Cairo. And while I was here, being a regular junior year abroad student and doing all my coursework and everything, I spent every waking moment I could on the Giza Plateau and really got to know it really well firsthand, walking everywhere. It was a lot freer then, less secure, less concern about security and so on. And bedrock reality just didn't add up to the beliefs, that brought me there. And so I started asking, well, what is the real story here? And of course, that's the story I've been following for most of my 50 years here in Egypt.
So, I guess one of the biggest questions that we'll constantly return to is what do the Great Pyramids represent to humanity? But maybe let's be more intimate. What do the Great Pyramids represent to you?
Well, to me, the Great Pyramids are, catalyzed a research program, an interest that you've been asking about before that, has basically kept me going for all these years. And, as we talked about before we went live, uh, I still find new things about old things. Every time I go up to the plateau, I have my camera, and I've probably the largest collection of photographs on the Giza Plateau in the world. but my camera's kind of like my notebook, and I'm still taking pictures, many pictures I've taken many times before, but I'm always seeing something new. And so for me, the Great Pyramid means, and not just the Great Pyramid, but the whole Giza Plateau, and in a larger sense, all of ancient Egypt, means a lifelong interest, of uh, a quest to know what is real and what is true. Um, After I'd been here for a while and walked the plateau for a good number of years, well, a couple of years, I experienced what social psychologists call cognitive dissonance. And that is where information that has its own source of validity, usually from the real physical world, impinges on or competes with information that you have from revealed sources, whether it's your beliefs that were handed down to you from your parents, from religious figures. And in this case, of course, it was my beliefs, that coming from the Edgar Cayce worldview. And what was impinging upon them was the archaeological record. Just didn't add up. But that for me was a catalyst, that inspired a lifelong interest in belief systems and how belief systems work. Before I came to Egypt, I was majoring in psychology, religion, and philosophy at the University of North Dakota. And I was always reading widely in philosophy and those subjects. And it used to be that it was strange to be interested in why people believe things, you know. The people who seemed least interested in talking about that were people who really believe things. But nowadays, it's really old hat. It's a common, do you believe in an election? Do you believe in COVID? You know, we have, trolling. We have gaslighting. And it's really amazing how sort of beliefs and why people believe and what to believe is now, a common concern. And so people really don't know what to believe, do they? And they tend to believe, pretty much what they want to believe, what they're predisposed to believe, especially in politics and social issues and identity politics. But and it's hard to know. But for me, I really drilled down on one subject, and I really know one subject really well, and that's the Giza Plateau. And beyond that, Egyptian archaeology and sort of the archaeological record worldwide.
What philosophers influenced you in terms of guiding your perspective on belief? Are there any standouts, any pieces of any texts that you remember?
Well, when I was young, when I was studying philosophy at the University of North Dakota, one philosopher that fascinated me was Martin Heidegger. He's a German philosopher, and he wrote a book called, in English, Being in Time. And it was really interesting because Martin Heidegger was very influential in a lot of modern thought, postmodern thought, like critical theory, for example, as is expressed in critical race theory. And you can almost, I think you can trace a philosophical kind of root system back to Heidegger through, the existentialist philosophers, Sartre and Derrida and Foucault, and from them, to critical theory, which comes out of the Frankfurt School in Germany, and even, multiculturalism. But the irony is, and I discovered this irony later, that Martin Heidegger, you know, was a little bit too close to the National Socialist Party in Germany, the Nazi Party. And that aspect of Heidegger's career, of course, is still discussed. How could somebody who wrote with such clarity about being in the world actually go for something so banal and evil? But I think an even greater influence for me was Buddhism and Hinduism. It
Really?
was my dream to go to India. I studied the Upanishads, the Rig Veda. I was flunking French, but I was, reading the Bhagavad Gita. And and then Buddhism became an even stronger influence, especially Zen Buddhism. And, going through my experience with belief systems and my own cognitive dissonance in Egypt sort of tempered being accepting of any worldview or But I would say of all the different religious and philosophical, if you could call Zen and Buddhism philosophy, it's not quite that. But I think the what influences me most would be Zen Buddhism because ideally it's the least burdened with gods and images and icons and so on. Zen is just, um, sort of plain and simple as the truth. Of
Hmm.
course, that's what I thought until I went to Japan and actually stayed in a Zen monastery and toured, the Zen monasteries in Kyoto and so on. And whoa, they have big statues and politics and, as well. But anyway, um, so I think, the Far Eastern religions, which I read in English, of course, um, were very influential in terms of my worldview. But my whole approach in my research in Egypt is not so much like Martin Heidegger's approach, which has some affinities with Far Eastern religion in terms of they don't have this separation between the mind and matter, subject and object, self and world. That dichotomy, you know, us and the world outside us runs right through Western philosophy. But it's exactly that dichotomy, that separation that Heidegger was trying to bridge. And so do the Eastern religions. Yet that dichotomy is still essential to everything I do in archaeology because you have a theory and you test it against bedrock reality. So, so I've actually been operating on that different paradigm that there is a real world, there is truth. You see, apropos of what we just said about belief systems, there is a way to test. I mean, is Atlantis out there, buried somewhere around the pyramids because there were thousands of Atlanteans building the pyramids or not? If I go out there, can I find a pink elephant or I don't?
Hmm.
Can it be either or both? No. In archaeology, not so much.
Right.
So, so yeah, I'm thinking in the interview here a little bit because of the questions you're asking. But those were the influences on me from the point of view of philosophy and psychology and religion. But yet, my whole career is premised on the idea that things are testable. There is a real world. There are facts, and things are either true or false.
Speaking of that, speaking of the real world and testing of the facts, I read online that you said you had to turn your back to truly understand the pyramids.
Well, the pyramids and a lot of Egyptian archaeology has been done by, excuse me, Egyptologists who have been largely traditionally in about 200 years of Egyptology, a little more now, have been trained to be art historians and philologists or linguists, study, scholars of the ancient language. And an archaeological perspective, and I have a particular sense of that term, has been slower to emerge in Egypt than elsewhere. But an archaeological perspective, if you want to look at, say, the Mandan, Native American Mandan tribes in my home state of North Dakota, and you want to understand, their movements over generations and how they lived, you need to, survey the landscape, the Missouri Valley. You need to locate their settlements. Ideally, you should excavate their settlements and take samples of whatever is left from what they were eating and consuming to understand their whole life ways. That kind of perspective was slow to come to Egypt. But I realized after I went for my PhD late on, I was a late graduate student at Yale, and I was studying under archaeologists who were working elsewhere in the Near East, in Iraq and Iran and Syria. And they were really interested in, the kinds of questions I just said about the Mandan, Native Americans. They were interested, how did the first cities arise? How did people come together? Why did they change from being farmers living in small villages to, specialists in craft production and so on, scribes living in large cities? How did civilization arise? And the way they approached it was by like surveying a lot of the area around the Tigris and Euphrates, in Iraq, say, or North Syria, and mapping all the different ancient sites, and then trying to understand when those sites were there at different periods to understand population growth and so on. So they were very keen on, human population movements and the size of settlements. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, I had already been doing a lot of research and about the pyramids, and people were saying, well, it took 30 or 20 or 30,000 people to build, for example, the Great Pyramid, the very large pyramids. And it seemed to me, wow, that's the size of some of the earliest cities, in Iraq and Iran that I'm reading about. And 35,000 people is the size of my hometown of Minot, North Dakota at that time. It's about 47 now. Um, and so I was like, well, where are all these people? We found the pyramids, their temples, their causeways, the Great Sphinx, the tombs of all these, rather elite people. But where's the city of the workers? Where did they live? How were they housed? What would the excavation of it would be a city the size, of those in Iraq. If we could find it and excavate even a part of it, what would it tell us about how they were organized? And those questions, where are all the people? How were they housed? How were they fed? Uh, and in effect, how did the pyramids build Egypt? By feeding all these people, by gathering all these resources, um, a whole infrastructure must have been developed that must have been very important on spinning Egypt into the future of its civilization like a big gyroscope. And that's what I meant by to understand the pyramids, I had to turn my back to them. Because, if you don't understand the people who made a monument, especially one the size of the Great Pyramid, you don't really understand the monument. It's as though you found the Washington Mall, but you knew nothing of any, how Americans live, you know, how they got around, what they ate. You would look very, first of all, it would look very mysterious. And because the pyramids, from an art historical perspective, are simply a language point of view, studying ancient language, they look so anomalous, as though they're out there, up for grabs as to who built them and how and why. That's why you have all these, conspiracy theories and alternative theories, about Atlanteans and extraterrestrials and so on. If you look close, even at the pyramids themselves, they're very human monuments. You can see tool marks. So what I was asking, and why I wanted to turn my back to the pyramid, was to find the context. Context is everything in archaeology, and that's what was missing. The context, the people context.
So the people that built the pyramids were not slaves. So if
No, they were not slaves, but the whole slavery question is hugely confused, actually, especially, for a modern audience, because what what is totally understandable when I speak in say, in Eastern countries, but but for Americans and Europe, like Japan, and there was obligatory labor. It was a fact of life in the ancient world. Um, and again, I've given these examples before, but like on my grandfather's farm in North Dakota, my two uncles, they were obliged to labor for my grandfather. Of course, it's family, isn't it? But even as they grew into adulthood, they were obliged to labor. Now they couldn't say, well, no, I don't want to, but then they would have to leave, and my grandfather wouldn't feed them, his sons. But you take an Amish barn raising, the traditional Amish cultures, say in Pennsylvania and Ohio. A barn raising used to be a community event. It was a feast. So you got extra food, like Thanksgiving feast. It was a social event. You might meet a fiance or future husband. It was a religious event. There were prayers. It was a community event, and it was obligatory. Now, slavery, as it was practiced in the southern United States, was a bit anomalous, according to my reading about slavery in the ancient world, in that you have sometimes hundreds of people who can be family alienated, put to work, say, in tobacco fields and then cotton fields and so on. I mean, in a sense, one of the authors who wrote a well-known book on American slavery called it the peculiar institution, because worldwide slavery has existed in Rome and so on, and sometimes very severe, putting people to work in mines and Roman mines and so on, children. But by and large, you don't have these huge, uh, large numbers of slaves, like you did in the southern United States. And I think that's the vision people have in mind when they think about slaves and the pyramids. Now, the thing is, the continuum from obligatory labor from an Amish barn raising to, say, the slavery as it was practiced in the southern United States, it's a continuum of sorts. But I mean, the Great Pyramid is a hell of a barn, and it challenges all our visions of society. What we do know is that the ancient Egyptians and the Egyptians in the Old Kingdom, the first 1,000 years of the 3,000 years of ancient Egypt, they did capture people in war. And we know that any Egyptologist, probably knows that they would put them to work, which looks like slavery. It is the case, though, that in better documented examples, like in the New Kingdom, when they would capture prisoners of war and put them to work, they would have them building temples. And it's even the case that it's generally the case in ancient Egypt in all 3,000 years that people who came in conflict become part of Egyptian society and take on Egyptian culture. And yet they're still distinct as Libyans, Nubians, and so on. In the New Kingdom, sometimes these people who are put to work on building temples or on the lands that temples owned, because every temple was a huge landlord, they became part of the temple personnel. And in certain cases, they were more exempt from certain tax, labor tax, than the average Egyptians around them. So that's a bit of the difference there. But in our excavations of what we call, without too much exaggeration, the lost city of the pyramids, it doesn't look like slavery. I mean, there's a mix. We didn't know what to expect when we started excavating about 400 meters south of the Sphinx. And nobody had really excavated the settlement where the pyramid builders lived, except for one little patch at Giza. And, would we find campsites, where people are living in tents or reed shelters, and we would see them, the remains would be post holes and so on. What we found looked precociously modern. It was four big blocks of galleries, comb-like galleries. Each gallery is about the width of a hotel corridor. And they're very straight, and these blocks are very regular. The blocks of the galleries are separated by streets as wide as a city street, which is unusual in this ancient world because these people, from everything else we know, largely lived in villages with very narrow paths, just wide enough for two people to pass or a donkey and a person.
Mhm.
And here we have these big wide streets. They were paved with crushed limestone and compact, dark clay made it look like asphalt, an asphalt street, drains running down the middle. And in the backs of these little corridors or galleries, as we called them, we found little room structures that looked like other ancient Egyptian houses that were known. And at the backs of those little houses, at the backs of the corridors, we found kitchens for cooking, roasting, and baking. But largely the corridors were empty. And then when we excavated them very carefully, we started finding sleeping platforms and holes in a central wall that supported columns for a loft. We wondered, where are all the consumers? Because these galleries were about the size of a modern, shopping center altogether, 150 meters, so a football field and a half long,
Mm.
and nearly a football field wide. And around these galleries, we started finding bakeries, dozens of bakeries, where they were baking these big loaves of bread. Um, that, the bread pots themselves weigh 12 kilograms. And there were just millions and millions of broken bread pots from baking this bread. And then we were finding bone of animals. We save every scrap of animal bone, and our specialists can identify is it cattle, sheep, or goat. A lot of it was cattle, prime beef. And when our bone specialist could identify the meat bone, it a lot and age and sex it, if he had the right part of the bone and enough of it, it tended to be cattle under 18 months and male. So actually, we've been doing this kind of archaeology where we save ancient plant remains, ancient animal bone, every scrap of information. We actually wash the dirt and pick out even bird bone and so on.
Mm.
And after doing this for 37 years, we literally have big data. I mean, AI might be very useful for us. So we're talking these patterns out of millions and millions of iterations of animal bone. It looks like they're taking the young male cattle which is common actually for people who raise cattle for meat. They're taking their young male cattle. You don't want to take the females because they reproduce. And these and the people who are living in these barracks, which is what we interpreted the galleries to be, are eating prime beef, a diet very high in protein and carbohydrates. But the thing is, this is a very radical thing for 4,500 years ago. Because as I said just earlier, these people probably all lived in villages with winding streets. And now to be channeled into these galleries, each one with a kitchen where their people are cooking food for them for that team, it must have been a very radical socializing experience and a very different cognitive space than their villages that they were used to. But we do have evidence that they were put into these galleries in rotation. They rotated in and out in terms of this obligatory labor for the royal project, and they were brought to Giza and worked in groups, home-based fellowships. So it's like the North Dakota gang, the Carolina gang, even the Chicago gang, uh, and and so although the whole environment and the regimentation must have been very different than their home villages, they were kept together in their social groupings, their home-based fellowships. And that answers this question that's very important. Did the state, that is to say the royal house, the king, did they did they throw away a natural social order and override it? Or did they work through it? And it appears that they were working through it.
So can we kind of double click and talk about this really important archaeological discovery during your 50 years, the lost city? Like what is that and
Mhm.
how did you come to find it? And what does it represent? What does it mean for the future of Giza?
Well, the lost city is by the lost city, I refer to the area of our excavations where after working at the Sphinx for 4 or 5 years and mapping it stone by stone, the Sphinx became a key that led to a wider understanding of the whole Giza Plateau for me. First, it's a cross section in the natural layering of the plateau. The plateau is limestone, and the head, the neck, the body of the Sphinx shows the layers of limestone because they carved it right out of the natural rock. They preserved a block that they used to carve the Sphinx when they were quarrying all around it to take stone away for building pyramids and temples. And so I thought, well, in front of the Sphinx, there are two temples. One is the Valley Temple of the second pyramid. The other is a temple where they meant to worship the Sphinx. And the blocks from those temples came from different layers in the body of the Sphinx. And I worked with a geologist to trace the blocks from the Sphinx quarry back to the temples. And that was kind of cool. And, I could see that they were building the Valley Temple when they were working down through the head and neck layers. And then as they went deeper, they started building the temple next to it, right in front of the Sphinx. So already this was in the 1980s, and computer graphics were just sort of starting. And I thought, wow, with computer graphics, we could unbuild the Sphinx and its temples. What if we could do that with the whole Giza Plateau, the pyramids, all three pyramids? And so that started me to be interested in the geomorphology, basically the shape of the landscape and the geology. And the other was the astronomical alignments of the Sphinx with the equinox and the solstice sunsets. And that started me mapping the whole Giza Plateau. And, that led to an understanding, well, the pyramids are all aligned on a north, east, southwest diagonal on the high part of the plateau, so they're all at the same level. And the quarries are all down lower. And then beyond that, there's a valley that leads right to the mouth of those quarries. And then the bedrock rises up again in another geological formation to the south. But it seemed to me if, as I went to Yale and started studying, human populations and anthropology and that kind of archaeology, I started thinking, well, if there are 20 or 30,000 people out there, or however many, they must be out there beyond, the quarries. And this valley must be the conduit for non-local materials. And at the mouth of that valley, there should be a harbor. In one sense, it's very simple. So there's fancy words for this, like spatial analysis, geoarchaeology. But in one sense, they dug a deep hole and they made a big pile And we should look for the people who did the digging and the building out beyond the hole. And that's where we found this huge stone wall called the Wall of the Crow, 200 meters long. It was originally 10 meters high, and there's a gate through it about 7 meters high. It must be one of the big gates in the ancient world. And for all the world, it says, Lost City out here, look out here. And so I predicted, yeah, there should be, the city should be out there. But um, we went out to dig starting in 1988, 89. We're still excavating out there. We'll be excavating out there this coming September. And that's one of the most satisfying things in my career is to say, the people and their settlement and their infrastructure should be out there. And there we found it. And we've actually mapped it over an area of about 7 to 10 football fields, about 10
Wow.
hectares. But we know the city, the lost city, was much bigger than that. It's underneath what is now the modern city and probably will never be got. But we learned more about this lost city when with the what I think for me is the greatest archaeological discovery of my career, the Wadi El Jarf papyri, which a colleague and friend Pierre Tallet from the Sorbonne and a French team, found at a port of Khufu on the Red Sea. And that those papyri, which are actual documents at the time of building the pyramid, actually tell us the city was even bigger and arced around the entire promontory of the Giza Plateau. And what we have excavated is just one part of it.
So speaking of that, how do you think the geography of Egypt and its natural resources shaped the civilization? Are there any interesting things about it?
Sure, the geography of Egypt is huge in shaping the civilization. First of all, Egypt, the settled part of Egypt where people live and deploy their civilization is really just the Nile Valley. And it's bordered on both sides by desert. And immediately it's bordered by fairly high cliffs until you get to the delta, which fans out to the Mediterranean. So Egypt, the overall geography of Egypt, it looks very much like a papyrus plant. There's the delta, which, is V-shaped, fanning out to the Mediterranean. There's a narrow little stem, which is the capital zone, where they always establish their capitals. And then as you go into Middle Egypt, the valley gets very broad, is moving south. Of course, the Nile moves from south to north, so we say going into Upper Egypt. Right there at that narrow little neck, there's an even narrower little stem, and then there's a leaf of green land, which is the Fayum Oasis. It looks like a bud, or a leaf. So then we have this broad valley of Middle Egypt, and then way down south, it turns. Actually, let me start the other way because the flow of the Nile. At the very far south, right at the border of Egypt and the Sudan, or what was Nubia, the Nile Valley was almost nothing. And then it gets wider and wider, but not very wide. And then at Luxor, where you have the Valley of the Kings with Tutankhamun, the valley turns and it starts to run to the west. I'm sorry, to the east. It turns and starts to run to the east, and it curves and goes north, and then it curves back and runs west, and then it continues to the north. This big bend, if you just look at Google Earth, look at Egypt, pan way back to see the whole thing. This Kenna Bend, named after the town of Kenna at the top of the bend, and of course, modern Luxor is at the bottom of the bend. This Kenna Bend is the homeland of pharaohs. 3 times, and I emphasize this to graduate students, and I don't even know if my colleagues recognize it enough, that if you look at the 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, fast forward, basically it expands out of the Kenna Bend and contracts, expands out of the Kenna Bend and contracts, expands out of the Kenna Bend. That's the homeland of pharaohs. The very first dynasty that united all of Egypt in about 3000 BC came out of the Kenna Bend. Pharaohs would march across that broad valley of Middle Egypt, and then they would take that skinny little neck of Nile Valley right below the delta. Why? Because that's where you want to tie the two lands together, the delta and the Nile Valley. Egypt was known throughout ancient times as the two lands, and that's the capital zone. That's where you tie it together. The reason I think that civilization emerged out of the Kennebec is because of the way they did agriculture. Every year, without fail, the Nile would flood because of the monsoon rains in East Africa. And this flood wave would pass through Egypt from south to north. And at any place in the Nile Valley, it looked like a lake with the villages like little islands. The Egyptians would capture the floodwaters in huge basins defined by dikes so that the silt would fall down and replenish the cultivation, the agricultural land. And then they would flush it into the next basin to the north and all the way down the row. Well, the Kennebec, the basins were just the right size, and it was easy to flush the water away. That's important, as the flood recedes, because if you can't manage the water, you can't farm either. Too much water is bad as well. The desert thrusts forward all the way to the river almost regularly in defined spaces in the Kennebec so that the water has nowhere else to go but back into the river. When you get into Middle Egypt, the basins are huge and broad, and the Nile Valley is very broad, like 20 kilometers, which is a lot for the Nile Valley. And it's really hard to control the floodwaters. And all these floodwaters would back up over that narrow neck of Nile Valley, the capital zone, every October, which is about the flood would start in late June, it would peak in mid-August, it would start to recede, in the October. So it was not only critical politically to tie the Delta and the Nile Valley together, it was critical to manage these floodwaters. And that's why pharaohs would march from the Kennebec, where the flood was manageable, across Middle Egypt and grab that narrow neck so they could control the delta. And if you control the delta, you control everything that is now, to the northeast, what is now, Gaza and Israel and Jordan and Palestine and Syria and Lebanon. And, in days of empire.
Lebanon, officially the Republic of Lebanon,
Oh,
is a country in the Levant region of West Asia.
I'm sorry, people. No, my Siri is going rogue.
That's AI taking over.
Actually, I got all my information I'm telling you from Siri right here.
Oh wow, you said it so well.
No. So I mean, I'm sorry, but for me, the broad strokes of Egyptian geography hold a lot of the explanation for the patterns we see for 3,000 years.
Yeah, and speaking of back to the pyramids, there is an incredible precision with them. And we always talk about all the conspiracies, but do you think there is any seriousness to this? Is there a forgotten technology or a lost technology that was used to construct the pyramids? And would this change our understanding of this ancient innovation?
It's interesting you asked this question because last week we were in the final days of laser scanning the floor around the Great Pyramid. I was working with a Danish team from the Organization of Danish Museums who are specialists in, they're all Viking archaeologists, but they're
Hmm.
specialists in laser scanning and with Soren Sindbæk from Aarhus University. And we were doing this because, people wonder, how did they build the pyramids? And they ask what you just asked, is there any secret technology? And one of the things it seemed to me over my 50 years here that people wonder, how do they build the pyramids? How did they build the Great Pyramid, which is the most unusual of all the pyramids, by the way. It's not the most normal, it's the most unusual.
Hmm.
But how did they do it so accurately? And yet they're not mapping the evidence. So I've always noticed these holes in lines parallel to the sides of the pyramid, cut into the bedrock. These holes were covered by the pavement of the courtyard that ran around the pyramid, so they weren't meant to be seen. The courtyard has largely been ripped up, so you can see them. They're spaced every like 3.5 yards or 3.5 meters, and they run very nicely parallel to the side. And for all the world, it seemed to me this is where they put the stakes down for the reference line to measure, create the pyramid. And so we had mapped them in earlier years, and we mapped them with, surveying instruments, a total station. But the Danish team, offered to survey them with laser scanning. So we actually have a facsimile captured for all time. And in the course of mapping, we were able to clean the base of the pyramid. This is just in the last 3 weeks. Some parts of the base hadn't been cleaned. I'm talking it's clean. I mean, the tourist authorities and the antiquities authorities keep it very clean. But there are crusts of rain-washed sand and dust on some parts of this beautiful platform that Khufu's builders made to put the casing stones. And my God, the joinery in that platform just simply amazed me, even after all these years. Modern masons will join the front of the stones at the front of a wall, so they look like not even a millimeter. But behind it, they just pull the stone away. And you can just stuff it with mortar. You see, to get a fine join for any length, you have to really shave the two stones to come together perfectly.
Mhm.
But the joins on that platform go back a meter and a half, you know,
Wow.
like something like, you know, 6 feet. And it's just amazing masonry. And yet, if you stand on that platform and look up to the mass of the pyramid, there's a huge slop factor. The stones, there are no modular stones. They're all different shapes and sizes. You can see where they just stuff big globs of mortar. Some tour guides say no mortar in the pyramids. It's the precision is in this outer shell and the platform and the casing. And the precision is in this masonry of the chambers. And then they just stuff in between, you see? So when they ripped off all the casing, you can see the slop factor in the core. Well, how did they do that? One of the things I've noticed over my career is that, I've done a fair amount of reading on technology and how technology evolves. And people who write on the history of technology will write like, about technical innovations, like an iPhone. And innovations take a while to become integral to the infrastructure like iPhones and smartphones are now, right? But when they look at ancient Egypt, and when I look at ancient Egypt, and you have the rise of the giant pyramids, and there are only about five of them, maybe six, over about 3 generations. It's not like all the pyramids are gigantic like the ones at Giza. No, they started making little cookie cutter pyramids in effect. So in the rise of and then all the infrastructure that went into making these giant pyramids became more important than building a giant pyramid. You know, the trade routes to Lebanon and Syria to get timber, you know, expeditions way out into the Western desert and out to the Red Sea to get copper, new farms and ranches to feed all this cattle to the workers. All that infrastructure became more important than building a gigantic pyramid. And that's why I say, in a sense, the interesting question is how the pyramids helped to build Egypt. And once that infrastructure was in place, it became more important than building a gigantic pyramid. And hence you have the cookie cutter pyramids. It's not unlike, our freeway system, which some say started, to move nuclear weapons around, or the internet, which some say was, devised for military communication. And now it's far more important than any original reason. But in all this, pertinent to your question, was there an advance in their technology? And it doesn't look like there really was in terms of the physical technology. In other words, in the first dynasty, some 400 or 500 years before the Great Pyramid, they have copper already. They have pretty much the same tools, the same tool kits. The real advance in technology was in organizing people. And there's a person who's written about technology, Brian Arthur. Um, And he talked about how technology is capturing behavior, capturing phenomena. For example, the steam engine captures air and water, electricity, electrical systems capture electricity. He said, but phenomena can not just be physical, like wind and fire and air and electricity. It can also be behavioral.
Mhm.
And the real advance in the Pyramid Age was organizing people. So to go back to your question about our galleries, for example, they look like the architectural equivalent of Excel spreadsheets. Nobody had organized people like that before. And earlier you asked me, what is the significance of what I've found? And you then turned it personal, to you personally. And so I went off on the personal thing. But one of the main reasons what we found in the so-called lost city site is important is in how you are organizing and pulsing people through a structure. People who write on the history and sociology of buildings talk about the first institutional buildings like hospitals, schools, and prisons. Hospitals, for example, coming about the 1200s AD. They started converting cathedrals. They put little cells in so people, sick people, could be in the cells in the cathedral, which, in institutional buildings, think about it. In a normal building, like a house, or even a church or a post office, the people in control, the people who kind of own the building, stay in the deep cells. So, like in your house, you occupy the bedroom and the bathroom and the kitchen. But when you receive guests, it's out in your living room and your parlor. Or in a post office, the clients come in and the clerks and the post office masters, they occupy the deep cells and sort the mail. In a church, the clergy or the God, God, and our temple, the gods or the God herself, occupies the deep cells. But in an institutional building, the visitors occupy the deep cells, and those in control are outside. Maybe they have their own, you know, homes and houses elsewhere. But so, like in school, the students come and go, but when they come and they occupy the deep cells, the classrooms, prisons, hotels, hospitals, what we're finding is really one of the world's, if not so far, the world's oldest institutional building for pulsing people, like a prison, school, hospital, or hotel. And it's emerging, or, they're coming up with this way of storing and pulsing people in order to build that Great Pyramid. The scale that they attempted. Um, so the innovation, to go back to your most recent question, is really in the technology of behavior and not in the technology of physical forces.
Sure. So just based on that, I know we're running out of time, but I do want to double click on this one as well. So there were not any direct or explicit um, evolutions of the physical technology, but were there any direct or explicit evolutions of the social technology that you described, the social organization that they had?
Yes. Well, first of all, what I just said is an innovation. And one of the problems, Piyush, is that my we have similar buildings, in later Egyptian periods, like 1,200 years later, at the time of the New Kingdom. I mean, think Tutankhamun is 1,200 years after, the Giza pyramids. You're starting to get around the temples structures that look like our galleries. But the big question, one of the frustrating things in my career, is that we have found this amazing footprint of the state and a footprint that looks precociously modern with the streets and the blocks and I wish my colleagues were trying harder to excavate settlement at the other pyramid sites in the valley. But a lot of excavation is still focused on tombs and tombs and tombs and tombs. And you learn a lot from tombs when they're inscribed and they're beautiful. And of course, you get on Discovery and, National Geographic. But I don't know. I don't have what we call in academia comparanda. I don't, is this unique? Is it a one-off thing? Like it almost looked like our 1969, landing on the moon was going to be kind of a one-off thing because, and we went back to the moon a few times, but then, through the 70s and 80s, not so much. Or did it continue to evolve and develop? This is a short way of saying, in answer to your question, I don't know.
Sure, sure, that's fair. Is there this is kind of an abstract question, but is there a piece of technology that you would like to design or create that would aid you in deciphering and discovering more about the Giza Plateau and about this civilization? Just
Oh, excuse
science
me.
fiction or
A piece
hypothetical.
of technology that I would like to design or create or invent. Yeah, time travel.
Mm,
Um, I've often thought, sometimes I would walk out onto this knoll, this peak way to the south of the pyramids above our lost city site. That's where I started thinking about here could be the lost city site. And at sundown, I would see the moon come up in the east, and I'd see the sun go down in the west, and the call to prayer would rise from hundreds of mosques. But the whole pyramid panorama from this perspective is there below me. And it's still not discovered by the tourist industry. Otherwise, they're going to put a ski lift up there. And I would think if only I could be back there for 5 minutes, 15 would be better. Just a glimpse to see, what was happening. I think just that glimpse would explain so much. And so time travel, but of course, one doesn't even know in terms of physics whether that's possible. But the discovery of the Wadi al-Jarf papyri is the closest thing I have. In 2013, as I mentioned, Pierre Tallet, a friend and colleague from the Sorbonne, and a French team were excavating a port of Khufu on the Red Sea. There were these big parking garages. They look like Amtrak garages for the ships. They actually had like ships kits. They would take the ships apart and put them in these big caves. And then they would go back to the Nile Valley. And when they returned to this port to sail across to Sinai to get copper, they would put the ships back together. And there, in stones that plugged some of these ship storage galleries, they found these papyri. And the papyri were not about the Red Sea or about going to get Sinai. They were the journal of a guy named Merer who was leading a group of guys on a boat delivering stone for building Khufu's pyramid. There's so much information there with place names, descriptions of the harbors, mentions of people that we know from their tombs. The Wadi al-Jarf papyri was probably the nearest thing I have to a time machine, going back and seeing what it was really like. You can read about it in a book called The Red Sea Scrolls that I was honored to write a small part of with Pierre Tallet.
Fantastic. No, I'll definitely add that to my Amazon cart. Just a couple of last questions. And if you'd like, we can skip this, we can cut it out. But do you have any opinions on the alternative archaeologists like Graham Hancock?
Huh. Well, so yeah, I mean, I started, from a kind of alternative point of view. And it's no secret. I even lecture about it. I recently started giving lectures because I'm old. What am I going to do? Lose tenure? I lectures about the whole arc of my career from coming from North Dakota to, Edgar Casey and so on. And my experience with cognitive dissonance and then trying to find out what the real story of Egypt is. So of course, the ongoing alternative take on archaeology in Egypt is certainly a part of that. Yeah, and I've thought a lot about it. I'd like to write about that in terms of writing about, my quest and belief systems and so on. And I mean, I know Graham Hancock. We've talked. And um, I used to be like adamantly opposed to them. I suppose because there's no anti-smoker like an ex-smoker kind of thing. But as time went on, I just found their work boring because I could so little relate it to what is so real out there on the plateau. And, the dialogue goes on. For example, not too many years ago, this major discovery was made in Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, where you have monolithic architecture and circles and so on. And it dates formidably early, 9,000, 11,000 BP before present. And so Graham Hancock, for example, is all I'm sure you can see it online. It's like, okay, here's monumental architecture from that very early period, and the Sphinx is monumental architecture. So maybe people and I mean, in one sense, Graham Hancock is right. This was a surprise. And as a very prominent archaeologist said, it is formidably early. And it started a whole dialogue among archaeologists of people were gathering and creating more sophisticated structures earlier than we heretofore had thought. Touche. But I mean, it's still the dating of the Sphinx is fairly secure within millennia. And there's this whole context of the Sphinx, and that would be another whole hour I used that we could go into that, for me makes it certain the Sphinx dates to the time of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. But I do have to say that I used to read it, and I was more keen on responding to it for a popular audience. But I have to say that, there's so much material that's real out there. I'm not finding, laser guns or aluminum or, there's just not even a stitch that would suggest anything like Atlantis out there, that it just started losing interest for me. And in terms of my interest in beliefs and phenomena, I still, have a library. I still buy the books, but I'm more interested in what's real. And I'm kind of at a point where, well, if people want to believe that, that's fine. Okay. I'm going to carry on with the thing about those ideas, it doesn't go anywhere. And I'll just make this final point on that. Early on, when the internet was getting started, I read an article about how hot links were just appearing in books that were digitized. And, in the old-fashioned library, you take out a book and you read it. Oh, there's a reference to another book. You have to go to that book. And now, with books being digitized and hot links and so on, you can actually just click on the figure number and boom, you're at that book. But the point in this article was, I actually think in the New York Times book review, said that people are actually, like artificial intelligence, it's heuristic. One thing leads to another, to another, to another, to new questions, to new knowledge, and so on. And so it doesn't go around in a circle. The new age stuff goes around and around and around in a circle. I was into it 50 years ago. We're still not finding any Atlantean settlements that I know of.
Right.
I'm sure that Graham Hancock and those guys would come back and say, "Oh no, this great site with sophisticated architecture that was kind of mysterious." But worldwide, it just doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't lead to new research, to new questions. It doesn't grow the way, say, the computer industry or artificial intelligence does. It goes around and around in a self-referential circle. But if people want to believe that about the pyramids, that's fine with me. Now, I'm not
Yeah.
going to get like exercised and flame up about it.
Yeah. Not yet. Not yet. And we can definitely come back and have you on for a second round to talk about the Sphinx and
Sure.
anything else that we missed. But just as one of the last questions, what advice do you have for future Egyptologists?
Settlements, dig more of the settlements. We have so many tombs and statues and that dimension of Egyptian culture, but I would encourage digging more and more where people live their everyday lives. And just one final example, Luxor's a famous site. You have Karnak Temple and Luxor Temple by themselves, two of the most famous archaeological sites in the world. We have almost no information, and they're connected by a 3 kilometer avenue of sphinxes. I mean, it was a great city, but we have almost no information about people's houses, how they lived, everyday life in that city. And that's what we need. We need settlement archaeology, the kind we do.
If you had a magic wand and you could solve one problem in the world, what would it be and why?
If I could solve one problem in the world, if I could solve one sort of natural problem, it would be climate change. If I could solve one political problem, I would dearly love to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict
Hmm. And last
and
but
get
not
that
least,
resolved. Those two peoples could be so strong together.
mhm, I agree. As a last question, what gives you hope in the world?
What gives me hope is science. The best of everything we have is science, and science is based, back to our discussion about philosophy, in facts, in things being testable. If they weren't, we wouldn't have rubber tires and iPhones. It's really science and critical thinking that is the best of humanity and not propaganda and grandstanding, and it's the real world and testing ideas against the real world. So in a word, science.
Fantastic. Well, Mark, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thanks, Ayush. Your questions were really good. Really, actually stimulated thinking that some neurons that hadn't been activated for a while. Thanks.
I'm very happy. Where can we find you online?
So, to go to ERA, AERA web.org, put it in your browser and you'll be right there at our website.
Fantastic. Everything will be linked in the show notes. Mark, thank you so much.
Terrific. Ayush, stay in touch.